In the brutal current of World War II, history recorded many defeats that time itself seemed to have deliberately obscured. Some of them, though rarely mentioned by the public, played a decisive role in the balance of power and the strategic direction of the war. In the summer of 1942, when the Pacific became the focal point of conflict between the United States and the Empire of Japan, an unexpected disaster struck the U.S. Navy in the waters around Guadalcanal. That battle, fierce, bloody, yet silent, caused the deaths of thousands of sailors and nearly collapsed America's very first counteroffensive effort on the Southern Front. And yet, the irony lies in this: that very defeat became a pivotal turning point that helped Admiral Chester W. Nimitz consolidate his leadership and authority within the United States Navy. In the darkness of defeat, his bold decisions and strategic composure changed the entire course of the war in the Pacific. In early 1942, the skies over the Pacific were filled with smoke and uncertainty. After the devastating surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, Japan showed no signs of slowing down. Like a violent tidal wave, they swept through the Philippines, swallowed Malaya, ravaged the Dutch East Indies, and pointed their sword toward Australia. For the Allies, it was a series of rapid defeats, each defensive line collapsing, each island falling into enemy hands. Amidst that turmoil, a quiet but pivotal change took place within the U.S. Navy. Chester W. Nimitz, a son of Texas with sharp eyes and the calm demeanor of a morning sea, was called upon to take command. In late December 1941, he was appointed commander of the Pacific Fleet, replacing Admiral Husband Kimmel, who had taken the brunt of the blame after Pearl Harbor. Nimitz inherited a force fractured in both morale and strength, but within just a few months, he began to piece it back together. With a strategy that was both cautious and firm, he waited for the right moment, then struck decisively at Midway in June 1942. In that battle, 4 of Japan's main aircraft carriers were sunk, delivering a crippling blow to the empire's expansionist ambitions. The victory at Midway shook Tokyo and lit the first real spark of hope in Washington. But the dreamlike euphoria of victory was quickly doused by the cold water of reality. Though Japan had suffered heavy losses, it had not been defeated. Its fleet remained large, battle-hardened, and fueled by a thirst for revenge. Midway was a strategic victory, but not enough to shift the overall balance of the Pacific Front. Immediately after Midway, the top strategic minds of the U.S. Navy began to debate. Should they wait or strike again? Although the overarching Allied strategy remained Germany first, Japan second, meaning Europe was the priority, some, most notably Admiral Nimitz and Navy Chief Ernest J. King, understood that the window of opportunity in the Pacific was real, and it needed to be seized before it closed. Their eyes turned to the Solomon Islands, specifically to a dense, jungle-covered island named Guadalcanal. There, the Japanese were hastily constructing an airfield, one that could sever the vital supply line between the United States and Australia. If that airfield were completed and became operational, the balance of power in both the skies and waters of the South Pacific would tip decisively in Tokyo's favor. From what was essentially a calculated gamble, Operation Watchtower was born in haste, secrecy, and with considerable risk. On the morning of the 7th of August, 1942, the U.S. 1st Marine Division landed on the beaches of Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Gavutu Tanambogo, launching what would become one of the longest and bloodiest campaigns of the Second World War. But only a few hours after the first treads marked the sand, any illusion of an easy victory quickly faded. Maps were crude, the troops had no experience fighting in dense jungle terrain, and perhaps most dangerously of all, the Japanese fleet, lurking just beyond the trees, was still very much alive, quiet, and waiting to strike. Commanding the entire South Pacific theater was Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, a man known more for caution than daring, and at times, even pessimism. From his remote headquarters in Noumea, he ran the operation with a hesitant hand, rarely appearing at the front, and grew increasingly disengaged at a time when clarity and resolve were most needed. Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner led the amphibious forces directly, while Vice Admiral Frank J. Fletcher oversaw the naval support, bringing with him 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp. But the coordination among commanders was far from seamless, and each seemed to carry their own outlook, some wary, some uncertain regarding the risks of the mission. At Pearl Harbor, Chester Nimitz read each report with the gaze of someone who knew the stakes were far too high to afford failure. Guadalcanal was a test. If held, it would become the first stepping stone for America to regain initiative. But if lost, it could deal a crushing blow to his own credibility and send the Pacific front spiraling back into a tide of defeat. On the 8th of August 1942, just one day after the landing, the U.S. fleet was hit with a fierce counterattack from the Japanese. From their base in Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led a task force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, silently moving through the night along the Slot, New Georgia Sound, toward Guadalcanal. On the Allied side, the naval forces guarding the landing troops were stationed around Savo Island, consisting of 8 cruisers and 15 destroyers from the US and Australian navies, under the command of Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley of the Royal Navy. Due to a misunderstanding of orders, the Allied formation was scattered, leaving critical approaches exposed. That night, taking advantage of tropical rain and high maneuverability, the Japanese ships launched a surprise attack into the heart of the Allied fleet. Around 1 a.m. on the 9th of August 1942, the Battle of Savo Island erupted in pitch darkness. Flares and searchlights from the Japanese ships suddenly illuminated their targets. At close range, heavy naval guns and deadly long-lance torpedoes tore through the night, unleashing a storm of fire upon the Allied cruisers. In less than an hour of chaotic combat, 4 heavy cruisers were sunk, 3 American USS Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, and 1 Australian HMAS Canberra. Another cruiser was severely damaged, and 2 destroyers were hit. Over 1,000 US and Allied sailors were killed in that fateful night alone. This was considered one of the worst defeats in US Navy history, second only to the disaster at Pearl Harbor. As for the Japanese, Mikawa's fleet remained largely intact, suffering only minor damage to a few ships and a small number of casualties, a near-perfect tactical victory. The stark contrast revealed Japan's superiority in night combat tactics, while the American side was caught completely off guard and ill-prepared. Many U.S. officers and sailors didn't even have time to sound the alarm, partly due to a false sense of security, believing the enemy wouldn't dare attack so close to shore at night. Reeling from the shock, the Allied fleet descended into disarray. Crutchley's surviving ships quickly withdrew southward, away from danger. Admiral Fletcher, fearing air attacks on his carriers, made the controversial decision to pull all aircraft carriers from the area on the morning of August 9, less than 48 hours after the landing began. Without air and naval cover, Rear Admiral Turner was forced to make a painful decision: cancel the resupply mission and withdraw the transport ships from Guadalcanal earlier than planned. The retreat unfolded in a rush on the afternoon of August 9, so hasty that many transport ships pulled anchor before fully unloading their cargo. They took with them most of the food, ammunition, heavy equipment, and even essential items like 5-inch coastal defense guns and barbed wire that were meant to be left behind for the forces ashore. Like an undercurrent crashing through the night, the disastrous defeat at Savo Island had immediate and heavy consequences, not just at sea, but also on the jungle-covered island beyond. Within less than 24 hours of the initial landing, the entire U.S. Marine Force on Guadalcanal, 5 battalions under Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, suddenly found themselves completely cut off from the rear. The naval fleet was gone, the supply ships had fled, and the skies were empty of naval air cover. Vandegrift and his 11,000 men were now stranded on a remote tropical island, where dense jungles, brutal weather, and every clump of brush might conceal a Japanese machine gun. They had just captured the enemy's unfinished airfield, later named Henderson Field, but had no time to fortify or establish supply lines before being hit with a harsh reality. Meager food reserves, dwindling ammunition, no heavy artillery, no barbed wire, no anti-aircraft guns, not even enough malaria medicine. More threatening than any material shortage was the looming shadow from the north. Waves of ferocious Japanese counterattacks, determined to reclaim the strategic island at all costs. For the Marines who remained on the island from August 9 onward, every hope narrowed to a single goal: hold out until reinforcements arrived, or perish in the jungle and on the beaches. Guadalcanal had become a life-or-death gamble with no way out. Even the Japanese were surprised by their swift victory. After sinking the Allied cruisers, Admiral Mikawa decided to withdraw under cover of darkness rather than pursue the Allied transport fleet. He feared that come morning, his ships would be vulnerable targets for U.S. carrier-based aircraft. In reality, as mentioned earlier, the American carriers had already pulled back, but Mikawa didn't know that. His cautious decision inadvertently spared the U.S. Marines from immediate disaster. Had Turner's transport ships been destroyed on the morning of August 9, the Marines left on the island would likely have had no escape and may have been forced to surrender. Even so, Japan's triumph at Savo was enough to temporarily drive the Allied fleet from the area and secure control of the waters around Guadalcanal for several weeks thereafter. The grim news of the Savo Island disaster and the U.S. The fleet's withdrawal sent shockwaves through the military leadership in Washington. By mid-August 1942, the situation at Guadalcanal had become the most serious crisis for the U.S. in the Pacific theater since Pearl Harbor. President Franklin D. Roosevelt personally followed the reports with growing concern. He understood that if the campaign failed, Japan would solidify its defensive island chain and might even threaten the vital sea lanes to Australia. Roosevelt issued an urgent message to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, emphasizing, "I am deeply concerned about the situation in the Southwest Pacific. Every available weapon must be sent to that area to hold Guadalcanal at all costs. And once the crisis is stabilized, more ammunition, aircraft, and reinforcements must be sent to exploit the success." The president's order was clear. Guadalcanal had to be held, even if doing so meant pausing some commitments on other fronts. The highest level of political will was now in place. The question was how to act on it. Before the waters around Savo Island had even calmed, Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor had already made his move. An urgent cable was sent, requesting immediate reinforcements for Guadalcanal, both naval and air. Washington received the message, and Admiral Ernest King, head of the U.S. Navy, quickly supported the proposal. From the South Pacific, General Millard Harmon added his voice of alarm. In a bleak report, he expressed doubt that the Marines could hold out much longer without change. Guadalcanal, once seen as a secondary front compared to Europe, had now become an urgent flashpoint. The Department of Defense was forced to re-examine the Germany First strategy, recognizing that a loss at Guadalcanal would leave a critical gap on the Pacific map. As one historian observed, once the attack had begun, it was impossible not to supply the resources needed to achieve victory. The price of failure at Guadalcanal was too great to accept. In that sense, the defeat at Savo had unwittingly backed U.S. leaders into a corner, forcing them to throw their full support behind Nimitz, whatever the cost. In the weeks that followed, reinforcements were steadily poured into the Pacific. At Nimitz's suggestion, squadrons of B-17 and B-25 bombers, originally assigned to General MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific, were redirected to the South Pacific to help establish an aerial bridgehead over Guadalcanal. The first P-38 fighter planes were also dispatched. Despite logistical challenges, a mixed Marine Navy air unit known as the Cactus Air Force landed at Henderson Field as early as August 20, providing much-needed minimal air cover for the island. On the naval side, Admiral Nimitz boldly stripped reserve forces from the Hawaiian Islands to reinforce the front line, sending newly repaired warships from Pearl Harbor southward as quickly as possible. The aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, lightly damaged in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, August 24, was rushed through repairs under Nimitz's direction and returned to action by late October. Clearly, every trump card was being played to turn the tide at Guadalcanal. However, another major obstacle lay within the American ranks: Admiral Gormley's leadership spirit. As the crisis deepened, Gormley increasingly showed signs of fatigue and indecisiveness. From his headquarters in Noumea, he repeatedly sent back pessimistic reports, in one instance even suggesting to General Vandergrift on the island that he consider retreating into the mountains to wage guerrilla warfare, or surrendering, if the situation became hopeless. This defeatist proposal stunned many. Gormley's defeatism made its way back to Washington. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, also grew impatient and hinted that Pacific commanders would have to make do with existing resources. Nothing more can be spared. By early October, Admiral Nimitz had sensed that Gormley was no longer fit to lead such a grueling campaign. He needed someone with a fighting spirit to turn the tide. The most promising candidate was Vice Admiral William F. Bull Halsey, a fiery commander renowned for leading the bold Doolittle raid in April 1942, and who had narrowly missed taking part in Midway. Halsey was sidelined due to a skin condition, but his reputation and charisma earned him widespread respect among the troops. On the 15th of October 1942, Nimitz convened a meeting with his staff at Pearl Harbor. After deliberation, he sent a classified cable to Admiral King in Washington, requesting permission to replace Gormley with Halsey as commander of the South Pacific area. King's reply came swiftly, approved immediately. Just 3 days later, on the 18th of October 1942, Halsey flew into Noumea and formally assumed command. Old Bull, his affectionate nickname, was well known for his aggressive approach. Just as Nimitz had hoped, this leadership shake-up had an immediate positive effect. From that point forward, no one questioned the front's fighting spirit in the South Pacific. Many contemporaries noted that Halsey reignited the flames of morale on the front lines like a fresh gust of wind, dispelling months of gloom. With the helm now in steady hands and reinforcements flowing steadily to the front, the tide began to turn. Indeed, with increased support and Halsey's tough leadership, the Allies gradually regained the initiative. Fierce battles raged throughout late 1942. The Battle of Cape Esperance, October 11–12, brought the first successful U.S. naval night engagement, and especially the climactic naval Battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November, November 13–15, where U.S. forces, despite heavy losses, halted a Japanese fleet attempting to level Henderson Field. After that defeat, Japan's ability to reinforce the island began to collapse. By early 1943, the tide had turned decisively in America's favor. On the 9th of February 1943, under the command of General Hitoshi Imamura, Japanese forces completed their withdrawal from Guadalcanal, bringing an end to the grueling 6-month campaign. For the first time in World War II, the Japanese military was forced to abandon a campaign they had fiercely committed to, making Guadalcanal a pivotal victory for the United States and the Allies. Many historians would later argue that it was the string of naval battles around Guadalcanal, not Midway, that truly marked the turning point in the Pacific theater. So how could a quiet defeat in the middle of the ocean, specifically the Battle of Savo Island, serve as the springboard for Chester W. Nimitz's career? The answer lies not in a single factor, but in a chain of consequences the battle set off, and in how Nimitz turned crisis into opportunity. First, Savo jolted Washington into action. The appeals from Nimitz and General Harmon following the disaster quickly shifted the focus of meetings at the Pentagon and the White House. Guadalcanal was no longer seen as a secondary campaign. President Roosevelt personally ordered emergency reinforcements, even at the cost of diverting shipping resources from European allies. Thanks to that shock, Nimitz not only gained attention but also secured resources that had previously been far out of reach. Next, the defeat exposed serious weaknesses in the command structure, and Nimitz did not miss the chance to act. Admiral Gormley's indecisive leadership could not sustain the campaign in its most critical phase. Nimitz understood he needed someone with a different kind of energy, and William Halsey proved to be a turning point choice. Replacing a commander mid-campaign not only lifted troop morale, but also showcased the firm decisiveness expected of a high-level leader, a quality that only deepened Nimitz's credibility in the long run. It's also worth noting that not all defeats are publicly visible. Savo took place in the dark and was similarly veiled by the wartime fog of information. As a result, Nimitz's reputation was never seriously scrutinized or attacked by the public. On the contrary, he continued to appear as the steady hand steering the Pacific Fleet toward victory, rather than being associated with a failed beginning. In the world of military and political leadership, silence is sometimes the most effective armor. Lastly, Savo wasn't just a stumble, it was a strategic lesson. Nimitz quickly recognized the technical and tactical shortcomings. Night fighting capability, radar deployment, coordination among naval, air, and ground forces all demanded urgent attention. And he acted immediately. Just weeks later, at Cape Esperance, the improvements began to show results. What was learned from Savo helped make the U.S. Navy stronger day by day, and once again, Nimitz proved that a great commander is not one who never errs, but one who learns faster than the enemy. Chester W. Nimitz's career was not built on victories alone, but also on his ability to survive and grow through failure. Without Savo, he might not have received timely backing, lacked the justification to change commanders, and missed the chance to prove his mettle in crisis. Yet it was that very bloody defeat that became a catalyst, pushing Nimitz into the position he was meant to occupy. And so, on that historic day, the 2nd of September 1945, when Japan formally surrendered, it was he, not anyone else, who signed on behalf of the United States Navy to end the war. A moment of glory distilled through blood, steel, and near oblivion. There are chapters in the history of war that do not begin with the sound of triumph, but with the roar of defeat. The disastrous Battle of Savo Island on the 9th of August 1942 was one such chapter, a cold wake-up call to the U.S. Navy about the fatal cost of complacency and the real prowess of the Japanese enemy. It came close to sinking America's first counteroffensive in the Pacific before it could even set sail. But not every fall marks the end. Under the firm yet adaptable leadership of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, that failure did not become a final punctuation mark, it became the starting line for a relentless course correction. From the crucible of Guadalcanal, he and his team transformed risk into leverage, turning a campaign on the brink of collapse into a launching pad that gave the U.S. Navy the initiative. From Tarawa and Saipan to Leyte and Okinawa, Nimitz would go on to prove why he was the irreplaceable man in the Pacific. Beneath the story of a quiet failure lies a powerful lesson for anyone who has ever held a position of leadership. True strength does not lie in avoiding all mistakes, but in rising from them. Nimitz did not hide, did not blame, he confronted the truth, asked for help when needed, and adapted when circumstances demanded. As he once said, "You don't win by humiliating the defeated." After Savo, he did not demean his subordinates. Instead, he corrected course and pulled his forces tighter. That very spirit helped him overcome doubt and retain the trust of both superiors and subordinates alike. Today, the name Savo Island may not resonate like Midway or Iwo Jima, but in the grand mosaic of the Pacific War, it is an indispensable piece. Behind the casualty numbers were sleepless nights in command rooms and life-or-death decisions that shaped campaigns. That quiet defeat forged a more resilient Nimitz, a more seasoned Navy, and ultimately helped pave the way for America's final victory.